Welcome to the Elden Conspiracy. Farum Azula is probably the subject I have covered the most on this channel, mostly because the area is fascinating with all its lore implications. When arriving in Farum Azula and defeating its boss, our understanding of the world of Elden Ring is turned on its head. Being a floating city, having been struck by a meteorite and a storm of mysterious origin, there are many indications that Farum Azula was once on solid ground and connected to other regions. So in this video, I will examine the various extant theories about where Farum Azula was on land before it became a floating ruin. When we begin the game and look out on the breadth of Limgrave, one thing we all notice are the gigantic chunks of stone littering the landscape. Some of these ruins have a circular shape, and their carvings indicate they were made by an ancient civilization. The ruin fragment description calls this place a floating temple in the sky. These ruins of Farum Azula populate the western part of the Lands Between, specifically the Liurnia and Limgrave regions. Caelid does have several ruin chunks on its western side. The areas of Altus, Mount Gelmir and the mountaintops, as well as eastern Caelid and Grail's Dragonbarrow do not have Farum Azula ruins. I believe the locations of the Farum Azula chunks are vital to solving this puzzle. One thing to note is that the underground regions do not show any Farum Azula ruins at all. This shows that if the Eternal Cities were ever on the surface, they were probably sent underground before the Lands Between had contact with the Farum Azula civilization. It is important to make a distinction here. We do see chunks of Farum Azula which fell off from the floating city when it was shattered, struck by a meteorite, presumably. But we also see in the Lands Between Farum Azula's style structures in Leyndell and Grail's Dragonbarrow. These did not fall from the city, but were rather built by Farum Azulans who came to the Lands Between. What's odd is that we see no Farum Azula ruins near these Farum Azula style structures, even though the Bestial Sanctum and Upper Leyndell show architectural evidence of Farum Azulan cultural influence. The ruins of Farum Azula itself are on the other side of the continent. It becomes even stranger when we explore the catacombs. As many lore hunters have already discovered, the catacombs were not built in Marika's time, but rather repurposed from a previous regime. In nearly every catacomb, we see sarcophagi made in the Farum Azulan style. So some Farum Azulan people were interred here, or perhaps those ruled by them or associated with them in some way. So, we have Farum Azulan structures in the east, fallen Farum Azula ruins in the west, and Farum Azulan burial rituals everywhere. It goes without saying that this vastly complicates any attempt to find the original location of Farum Azula, if it was on the Lands Between at all. Let's look at several popular theories of Farum Azula's original location. As has been observed by many lore hunters, the 6 divine towers form a hexagon around a very conspicuous cloud at the center of this sea in the middle of the Lands Between. Many have suggested this was perhaps the location of Farum Azula when it was on land. If we examine the footprint of Farum Azula, we see numerous bridges of varying sizes, radiating from a central hub. The architectural style of Farum Azula emphasizes concentric circular designs and circular buildings. The bridges which connect Farum Azula to the outside could have connected to the Divine Towers. But the Divine Towers themselves don't appear to have any parts broken off, or show any indication a bridge had extended toward the sea. Also, the respective styles of the towers and Farum Azula bridges don't match up at all. The Divine Towers were most likely built by the Giants, or other culture allied to them. This is a completely different style and set of materials from those used to construct Farum Azula. So at this point, I have to say Farum Azula likely was not at the center of the Lands Between's inland sea. Still, the cloud at the center of the map is intriguing. It seems almost deliberately put there to obscure something. For now, we can only speculate. The next suggestion we often see is Farum Azula situated on the east of the Lands Between. We do find evidence of Farum Azulan people coming and building the Bestial Sanctum and 2 bridges in Grail's Dragonbarrow. Also, we see a mass grave in the northern part of this region, where the corpses of beastmen are embedded in stone, and the entire area is under constant rain and wind. While this area shows definite connections to Farum Azula, we do not see any ruins from Farum Azula itself. All the chunks from the actual city are on the other side of the continent. If Farum Azula was connected to the east of the Lands Between, wouldn't we see rubble in this area? But we don't. This complicates the theory. We've also heard it suggested that Farum Azula occupied what is now the Wailing Dunes. It does appear like a chunk of the landmass had been removed somehow, leaving the desert we see today. This area would definitely fit the footprint of Farum Azula, but again, the ruins we find here are giant ruins, not Farum Azulan. We find another inconclusive result. This is a less often suggested location, but I think it bears consideration. The west of the Lands Between is where we find the majority of ruins from the city itself. Around the Chapel of Anticipation, there's an anemic version of the storm at the center of Farum Azula. There are also numerous references to a true storm, which once raged in or around the area known as Storm Hill. Those who have watched my other videos know my theories about the Stormhawk clan, its relation to Stormvale Castle, and how I think the storm came to be in Farum Azula. I won't reiterate these theories here, suffice to say that the shared association with storms makes this area a viable location for Farum Azula. There is even a Beastman of Farum Azula boss we can encounter in a nearby cave. But we run into the same issues as we do elsewhere. While we see pieces of Farum Azula, which actually fell from the city, we don't see any Farum Azulan structures that were actually built here. All the ruins of old civilizations is either Giant, Old Dynasty, or Nox inspired. There also isn't anywhere along the west coast which shows evidence of a massive amount of land uprooting itself from the earth, at least not in any localized area. If we go north to the region of Mount Gelmir, we find this odd whirlpool in the ocean, drawn on the map in a very conspicuous way. There is an object at the center of this whirlpool, which looks somewhat like a tree root. As far as I know, there are no item descriptions or writings about this at all, and Mount Gelmir itself doesn't show any signs of Farum Azulan history. Each area, which seems promising, has several strikes against it. This remains an open question. We also have to wonder why every catacomb in the Lands Between happens to have Farum Azula sarcophagi. It could be asset reuse, or we can imagine in ancient times before the Erd Tree, when Farum Azula was in its heyday, people from there traveled far and wide, and if they died, were interred according to their culture's traditions. This shows that Farum Azula has been in contact with the Lands Between for a rather long time, since before the age of the Erd Tree, possibly. Yet even with this widespread influence, we still have no idea where the floating city may have actually been situated. Though we do see Farum Azula burial rituals in the catacombs and elsewhere in the Lands Between, if we go deeper, we don't see any evidence. The underground regions of the Lands Between appear to have no Farum Azula ruins anywhere. Some people may think this is a rather trivial point, but I think it's important to talk about. If the Eternal Cities and their old civilization cousins represent the oldest ruins on the Lands Between, we can comfortably say that Farum Azula, or the Lands Between's relationship to this city, is not older than the Eternal Cities, that these regions represent a pre-Farum Azula Lands Between, up until the creation of the catacombs. There is also the strange redundancy surrounding the events of Farum Azula's ruin and the destruction of the Eternal City. Both of these civilizations were evidently hit by an Astel meteorite, yet I think the complete lack of Farum Azula ruins in the underground rules out the possibility that it was the same Astel meteorite which destroyed both. These must have been different meteorites at different times. The flora and fauna of Farum Azula bears mentioning. Many creatures from the Lands Between appear here, including stormhawks, dogs, and the worm faces. The vegetation, though, is far more interesting. Most of the trees look the same as those from the Lands Between, except they look strangely drained of color, burnished like bronze, as if they were once gold. The deciduous and conifer trees we see in Farum Azula are the same models as those in the Lands Between. This could indicate a previous connection or simple asset reuse. There is this one unique tree model which appears to be in a state of partial petrification. These are the same trees we see elsewhere in Farum Azula inhabited by bestial skeletons. This could have some connection to the death root which has spread through the city, though this is a completely unique asset. There's also the cypress tree, another unique model we find in the parks and promenades. The worm faces are located in an area accessible by an elevator. They inhabit a lower part of the city, almost as if they have been quarantined off from everything else. They wear different clothing from those on the Lands Between. They are covered with seals, similar to the one on the back of Garok's hand, which keeps the Black Blade in check. So while they are the same being as those on the mainland, they come from a different culture. It is possible the worm faces manifested in both areas independently. But the most fascinating aspect of Farum Azula's design are the aforementioned bridges which radiate from the central hub. The ends of these bridges broke off in the course of Farum Azula's destruction. If Farum Azula was ever connected to the lands between, we should see the remains of the other sides of these bridges somewhere. In other words, we should see a clear footprint of ruined bridges leading inward, but we don't see this anywhere in the lands between. Given the lack of conclusive evidence, I would like to put forward a theory that Farum Azula was never connected to the lands between, but rather was situated on a different continent. Many descriptions mention areas outside the lands between, such as the Badlands, the Land of Reeds, and several other unnamed areas. The Draconian preset mentions a land of ancient dragons, where life is short. Farum Azula is, or was, famously ruled by the ancient dragons, so the city may have come from this area. We also have the description of the ancient dragon cult's prayer book, which implies that Farum Azula is outside the lands between. This description could be implying that Farum Azula was ruined so long ago that none lived to remember it, or it could mean Farum Azula was never a part of the lands between to begin with. The war with the ancient dragons occurred far before the Shattering, when Godwin was still alive. I would also posit that Farum Azula may have been situated on an island off the coast of Limgrave. This would explain the ruins in that region. But there doesn't appear to be anything drawn on the map to indicate this, if the clues on the map mean anything at all. A lot of people may think of this as a cop-out, that we need a novel interpretation of the evidence to solve this riddle. But I think this theory explains much of what we see. While the ruined chunks of Limgrave came from the city itself, the Bestial Sanctum and the Farum Bridges were built by inhabitants of Farum Azula who emigrated to the lands between. To me, this is a better explanation for the lack of conclusive evidence of Farum Azula's location than saying the city was caught in a time warp or was banished from the timeline altogether. The conclusive evidence is on another continent. This has been the Elden Conspiracy, signing out.